All right, Mrs. Ramsey, officers are on their way.
December 26th, 1996, 5:52 a.m. A mother's desperate voice crackles through Boulder Police Dispatch. "We have a kidnapping. Hurry, please." Within 8 hours, that kidnapping story would collapse. JonBenét Ramsey was found dead in her own basement. But here's what investigators couldn't understand. Why did her family act like they were hiding something? For 28 years, the Ramsey family's behavior on December 26th has been dissected, analyzed, and debated. Every word they spoke, every decision they made, every contradiction in their story. 3 people lived in that house the night JonBenét died. 3 people knew what really happened in those critical hours. And for 3 decades, their actions have raised the same disturbing question. Were they a family destroyed by grief or a family destroyed by guilt? Tonight, we examine the behavior that made investigators suspicious. The 911 call that may have captured more than anyone intended. The 9-year-old boy whose strange reactions puzzled experts for decades. The parents who hired lawyers before they hired grief counselors. And the contradictions that turned a murder investigation into a public trial that lasted 28 years. This isn't about evidence in a laboratory. This isn't about DNA or handwriting analysis. This is about human behavior under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. This is about how 3 people responded to tragedy and why their responses convinced half of America they were lying. Before we examine the behavior that divided a nation, make sure to subscribe to Unresolved the Case Study and hit that notification bell. Here, we don't chase theories or claim solutions. We examine why the most analyzed case in American crime history remains unsolved. We look at human behavior, institutional failures, and the gap between suspicion and proof. New investigations every week, focusing on cases where the questions matter more than the answers. If you've followed the Ramsey case for years, what you're about to see will challenge everything you thought you knew about that family's guilt or innocence. Hit that like button and let me know in the comments, when does grief look like guilt? And how can anyone tell the difference? Now, let's examine the behavior that haunted 3 people for 3 decades. Patsy Ramsey thought she had hung up the phone. At 5:52 a.m. on December 26th, 1996, after reporting her daughter's kidnapping to Boulder Police Dispatch, she believed the call was over. She was wrong. The line remained open for 6 more seconds, and those 6 seconds would create one of the most controversial pieces of evidence in criminal history. For years, that enhanced audio recording would be analyzed by the FBI, by independent audio experts, by television documentaries, and by millions of people who believed they could hear something the Ramsey family never intended anyone to hear. What they heard would challenge the family's account of that morning. It would raise questions about who was awake, who was present, and most disturbingly, what the family might have been discussing before they called for help. The official story was simple. Patsy woke up around 5:30 a.m. to prepare for their planned trip to Michigan. She went downstairs and found a ransom note on the spiral staircase. She read the note, panicked, and ran upstairs to check JonBenét's room. Finding the bed empty, she screamed for John. Together, they came downstairs. John read the note. Patsy called 911 immediately. Burke remained asleep in his bedroom throughout this chaos, not waking until later that morning when police arrived. But the enhanced audio from those final 6 seconds told a different story. Using sophisticated sound enhancement technology, audio analysts claimed they could identify 3 distinct voices in the background after Patsy believed she had ended the call. The first voice, a man's voice, firm and controlled. "We're not speaking to you." The second voice, a woman's voice, distressed but no longer hysterical. "Help me, Jesus, help me, Jesus." And the third voice, this was the voice that changed everything. A young male voice, possibly a child. "What did you find?" If these audio interpretations were accurate, They meant Burke Ramsey was not asleep in his bedroom as the family claimed. He was awake. He was downstairs with his parents, and he was asking questions about what had been discovered. The audio analysis became a battleground. Some experts insisted the voices were clear, unmistakable, proof that the family's timeline was false. Others argued that audio enhancement could create phantom sounds, that people could hear what they wanted to hear in static and background noise, that the quality was too poor to make definitive identifications. The Ramsey family's attorneys disputed the audio evidence entirely. They claimed the enhancement process was unreliable, that the supposed voices were artifacts of digital manipulation, that even if voices were present, they couldn't be definitively identified. They pointed out that no court had ever accepted this audio evidence because its reliability couldn't be established. But the damage was done. The audio raised fundamental questions about the family's honesty from the very first moments of the investigation. If Burke was awake and present during the 911 call, why did the family say he was asleep? What were they trying to hide? And if they were willing to lie about something as simple as which family members were present, what else might they be concealing? The timing implications were enormous. If Burke was awake at 5:52 a.m. when the 911 call was made, when had he woken up? Had he been awake all night? Had he discovered something before his parents did? The family's careful timeline. Everyone asleep by 10 p.m., Patsy waking alone at 5:30 a.m., the immediate discovery of the ransom note, suddenly seemed much more complicated. Detective Linda Arndt, the first detective on the scene, would later testify that Burke appeared to be asleep when she saw him that morning. But she arrived at 8:10 a.m., more than 2 hours after the 911 call. Even if Burke had been awake during the call, he could have returned to his room and gone back to sleep, or been instructed to stay in his room and pretend to be asleep when police arrived. The family's explanation for any discrepancies was trauma. They had just discovered their daughter was missing. They were panicked, confused, operating in crisis mode. Memory under extreme stress is notoriously unreliable. If Burke had briefly awakened and come downstairs, they might have forgotten about it in the chaos, or they might have wanted to protect their 9-year-old son from being questioned by police about his sister's disappearance. But investigators saw something else: consciousness of guilt. If the family was involved in JonBenét's death, if they had spent hours that night staging the crime scene and writing the ransom note, then of course Burke would have been awake. Of course he would have been present. And of course they would lie about it, because admitting Burke was awake would require explaining why he was awake, what he had seen, what he knew. The 911 call audio became a Rorschach test for public opinion about the case. Those who believed the family was innocent heard a traumatized mother making a desperate call for help with background noise that meant nothing. Those who believed the family was guilty heard evidence of deception from the very first moments, proof that the family was coordinating their story even as they pretended to discover a kidnapping. Years later, Burke Ramsey would address the audio evidence directly. In his 2016 interview with Dr. Phil McGraw, Burke stated clearly that he did not remember being awake during the 911 call. He said he remembered waking up to chaos in the house later that morning, but not to the initial discovery of the ransom note. When played the enhanced audio, Burke said he couldn't definitively identify the voices or confirm whether one of them was his. The audio enhancement controversy illustrates one of the fundamental problems with the Ramsey case. The same piece of evidence could be interpreted completely differently depending on what you already believed about the family's guilt or innocence. Technical analysis that seemed definitive to some experts was dismissed as unreliable by others. What should have been objective evidence became subjective interpretation. But beyond the technical debate about voice identification lay a deeper question about human behavior. If Burke was awake during the 911 call, his presence doesn't automatically prove family guilt. Children wake up during family crises. They ask questions, they want to know what's happening. A 9-year-old asking, "What did you find?" after his parents discovered his sister was missing would be a completely normal reaction. The problem wasn't that Burke might have been awake. The problem was that the family said he wasn't. And that inconsistency fed suspicion about everything else they said. In a case where investigators were looking for deception, every contradiction became evidence of guilt. Every unclear memory became proof of a cover-up. This pattern would repeat throughout the investigation. Family behavior that could be explained by trauma and grief was interpreted as evidence of guilt. Decisions made in crisis were analyzed as calculated deception. The Ramsey family found themselves in an impossible position. Any behavior could be seen as suspicious if viewed through the lens of guilt. And once that suspicion was established, it colored every interaction with law enforcement. The enhanced 911 call audio never definitively proved the family was lying about Burke's presence, but it didn't need to. It created doubt about their honesty from the very beginning. And in a case where public opinion would matter as much as evidence, doubt was enough to establish a narrative of family deception that would persist for decades. The 6 seconds of disputed audio from that 911 call would haunt the Ramsey family for nearly 3 decades. But if those background voices raised questions about what happened that morning, they were nothing compared to the questions raised by Burke Ramsey himself. A 9-year-old boy who lost his sister on Christmas night should have been treated as a victim, protected from suspicion, shielded from public scrutiny. Instead, Burke Ramsey became one of the most analyzed children in American criminal history. His behavior in those first days and weeks would be dissected by investigators, psychologists, and millions of armchair detectives who believed a child's reactions could reveal the truth about what happened in that house. For 28 years, Burke lived under a cloud of suspicion that began when he was in 4th grade and followed him into his late 30s. His childhood interviews with investigators, his unusual affect during family tragedy, his decades of silence broken only once, in 2016, by a television appearance that raised more questions than it answered. And finally, his legal battle against a media industry that had spent years suggesting a 9-year-old boy was capable of murder. This is the story of how a child victim became a lifetime suspect, and how the boy who should have been protected by the system became its most controversial figure. Burke Ramsey was 9 years old when investigators first questioned him about his sister's death. What they encountered was a child whose behavior seemed, to many observers, incomprehensible. While his parents appeared devastated, while his family's world collapsed around him, Burke seemed almost unaffected. He talked about his video games. He drew pictures. He smiled. And for the next 28 years, that behavior would follow him like a shadow. On December 26th, 1996, as police swarmed his house and his sister's body was discovered in the basement, Burke was taken to the home of family friends Fleet and Priscilla White. According to witnesses, he seemed remarkably calm for a child whose sister had just been found murdered. He played with toys. He asked when they could go home. He didn't cry. He didn't seem traumatized. To adults expecting a child in crisis, Burke's composure was unsettling. 2 days later, on December 28th, Burke was interviewed by Detective Fred Patterson and Dr. Suzanne Bernhard, a child psychologist. The interview was videotaped, and that footage would become one of the most analyzed pieces of evidence in the case. What investigators saw was a 9-year-old boy who seemed detached from the tragedy that had destroyed his family. Burke answered questions about his sister matter-of-factly. He described the previous evening, going to the Christmas party, coming home, going to bed. He said he hadn't heard anything unusual during the night. He claimed he hadn't gotten up, hadn't gone downstairs, hadn't seen JonBenét after they returned from the party. His answers were consistent, but his demeanor troubled investigators. The boy showed little emotion when discussing his sister's death. When asked how he felt about what happened to JonBenét, Burke said he felt sad, but his expression didn't match his words. He smiled frequently, even when discussing serious topics. He seemed more interested in the toys in the interview room than in the questions about his sister. Dr. Bernhard noted Burke's unusual affect in her report. She described him as emotionally disconnected, showing what psychologists call inappropriate affect, emotions that don't match the situation. When most children would be devastated, Burke seemed almost cheerful. When most children would be frightened, Burke seemed unconcerned. But child psychologists who later reviewed the interview offered different interpretations. Children, they pointed out, process trauma very differently than adults. Some children withdraw emotionally as a defense mechanism. Some children smile when nervous or uncomfortable. Some children focus on routine activities like toys and games because normalcy feels safe when everything else feels chaotic. Burke's behavior, these experts argued, could be explained by shock, by his age, by his personality, by the way his family had chosen to handle the crisis. 9-year-old boys don't always react to tragedy the way adults expect them to. His composure might have been strength, not guilt. His smiling might have been anxiety, not indifference. But investigators weren't convinced. They conducted additional interviews with Burke over the following weeks and months. Each time, his demeanor remained consistent. Calm, detached, seemingly untroubled by his sister's death or by the chaos it had brought to his family. Each time, investigators came away feeling that Burke's behavior was somehow wrong, somehow suspicious. The suspicion around Burke intensified when investigators learned about the bowl of pineapple found on the kitchen table. Burke's fingerprints were on that bowl, along with his mother's. JonBenét had eaten pineapple within hours of her death, but her parents insisted they hadn't given her any. If Burke had been eating pineapple that night, if JonBenét had joined him in the kitchen, it would contradict the family's timeline completely. When asked about the pineapple in later interviews, Burke's answers were vague and contradictory. Sometimes he remembered eating pineapple that night. Sometimes he didn't. Sometimes he remembered JonBenét being downstairs with him. Sometimes he didn't. His uncertainty about these crucial details only deepened suspicions about what he might be hiding. As Burke grew older, the speculation about his involvement grew darker. Internet forums and true crime communities developed elaborate theories about sibling rivalry, about a violent argument over the pineapple, about a 9-year-old's rage spiraling into tragedy. These theories painted Burke as the actual killer, with his parents discovering what had happened and staging the elaborate cover-up to protect their surviving child. The theories seemed to explain everything. Why the ransom note was written on materials from inside the house, why there was no sign of forced entry, why the family hired lawyers immediately, why they seemed so defensive. If Burke had killed JonBenét, either intentionally or accidentally, John and Patsy would have faced an impossible choice: call 911 and watch their son be taken into the juvenile justice system, or create an alternative narrative that would protect him. Burke's own family seemed to encourage his invisibility. For years after JonBenét's death, John and Patsy Ramsey gave interviews, appeared on television, wrote books, and fought to clear their names. Burke remained silent. He was homeschooled to avoid media attention. He stayed out of the public eye. He seemed to disappear entirely, which only fueled more speculation about what he might be hiding. The family's protective stance toward Burke was understandable from a parental perspective. They had lost one child to violence. They weren't going to lose another to public scrutiny. But from an investigative perspective, Burke's absence from public view looked like concealment. If he had nothing to hide, why was he hiding? As Burke entered his 20s and 30s, the speculation didn't fade. If anything, it intensified. True crime documentaries featured segments about Burke's unusual behavior. Internet communities analyzed every detail of his childhood interviews. His name became synonymous with one of the most controversial theories in criminal history: that a 9-year-old boy had killed his sister and his parents had covered it up. By his mid-30s, Burke Ramsey had lived more than 3/4 of his life under suspicion of murdering his sister. He had a degree in computer science. He worked in information technology. He tried to live a normal life, but normalcy was impossible when your name was associated with one of the most famous unsolved murders in American history. Then, in September 2016, CBS aired The Case of JonBenét Ramsey, a documentary that explicitly promoted the theory that Burke had killed his sister. The documentary featured forensic experts conducting experiments to show that a 9-year-old could generate enough force with a flashlight to cause JonBenét's skull fracture. They walked through a detailed scenario: Burke hitting JonBenét in a moment of anger, the parents discovering what had happened, the decision to stage an elaborate cover-up. The documentary didn't present this as one theory among many. It presented it as the solution to the case, the explanation that finally made sense of all the evidence. Burke Ramsey, now 29 years old, watched as a national television network accused him of murder on primetime television. For the first time in his life, Burke decided to fight back. 3 weeks before the CBS documentary aired, Burke sat down with Dr. Phil McGraw for his first and only public interview. For nearly 20 years, he had remained silent while others speculated about his guilt. Now, finally, he would speak for himself. The interview was extraordinary for multiple reasons. First, it was the first time the public had seen Burke as an adult, heard his voice, observed his mannerisms. Second, it was his opportunity to address the theories that had followed him for decades. And third, it revealed that even as an adult, Burke's demeanor remained unusually calm and detached for someone discussing his sister's murder and the decades of accusations that followed. Burke answered Dr. Phil's questions directly. He denied killing his sister. He denied that his parents had covered up anything. He described waking up to chaos in the house that morning, being taken to friends' homes while police investigated, learning that his sister was dead. He acknowledged that people suspected him and his family, but he maintained their innocence consistently. But once again, Burke's affect troubled viewers. He smiled frequently during the interview, even when discussing serious topics. When Dr. Phil asked him directly if he had killed JonBenét, Burke smiled as he answered no. When asked how he felt about the accusations, he smiled again. The smiling wasn't malicious or defiant, it seemed nervous, almost childlike. But to many viewers, it felt inappropriate for the gravity of the subject. Mental health professionals who watched the interview offered explanations for Burke's demeanor. Social anxiety, they pointed out, often manifests as nervous, smiling, or laughter. Some people smile when uncomfortable as an involuntary stress response. Burke had lived with social anxiety his entire adult life. Being interviewed about his sister's murder on national television would create enormous stress for anyone, but particularly for someone who had spent decades avoiding public attention. The interview accomplished Burke's main goal. He had finally spoken for himself, denied the accusations directly, and presented himself as a real person rather than a character in other people's theories. But it didn't eliminate suspicion about his behavior. If anything, it reinforced the perception that something about Burke was different, unusual, not quite what people expected from someone in his situation. 3 weeks after his Dr. Phil appearance, Burke filed a $750 million defamation lawsuit against CBS, the documentary's producers, and the forensic experts who had accused him of murder. The lawsuit claimed they had destroyed his reputation, caused him severe emotional distress, and damaged his ability to live a normal life. It marked the first time Burke had fought back legally against the accusations that had followed him since childhood. The lawsuit sent a message. Burke Ramsey was no longer willing to remain silent, while others destroyed his reputation. He was no longer the 9-year-old boy who couldn't defend himself. He was a 29-year-old man with legal resources and the determination to fight back against what he claimed were false accusations. The case was settled in January 2019 for an undisclosed amount. CBS never retracted the documentary, but the settlement suggested Burke's legal team believed they had a strong case. The settlement also suggested that there were financial consequences for media organizations that accuse someone of murder without definitive proof. Burke's legal victory was significant, but it couldn't undo 28 years of suspicion. It couldn't give him back a normal childhood or a life free from association with his sister's murder. It couldn't restore the privacy his family had lost or repair the damage done by decades of speculation. Today, Burke Ramsey is 37 years old. He works in information technology. He has stayed away from media attention since settling his lawsuit with CBS. He has tried as much as possible to live the normal life that was taken from him when he was 9 years old. But normal is something Burke Ramsey will never truly have. His sister's murder defined his childhood, and the accusations about his involvement defined his adult life. The tragedy of Burke Ramsey isn't just that he lost his sister. It's that he lost his right to grieve privately, his right to childhood innocence, his right to be treated as a victim rather than a suspect. Whether guilty or innocent of any involvement in JonBenét's death, Burke paid an enormous price for behavior that was interpreted as suspicious rather than traumatic. The questions about Burke's behavior that began when he was 9 years old never truly ended. His calm demeanor during family tragedy, his contradictory memories about crucial details, his decades of silence broken by a single interview that raised more questions than it answered, all of it contributed to a narrative of suspicion that followed him into middle age. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Burke's story is how easily a child's natural response to trauma was reinterpreted as evidence of guilt. How a 9-year-old's coping mechanisms became proof of deception. How a family's attempt to protect their surviving child was seen as evidence of a cover-up. Burke Ramsey's behavior may have been unusual, but unusual behavior doesn't equal criminal behavior. His smiling may have been inappropriate, but inappropriate responses to trauma are common, not criminal. His silence may have seemed suspicious, but silence is often the only protection available to those who cannot defend themselves against accusation. After 28 years, Burke Ramsey remains one of the most controversial figures in American crime history. Not because of what he did, but because of how his behavior was interpreted by others who needed someone to blame for an unsolvable tragedy. Burke Ramsey's strange journey from 9-year-old victim to lifetime suspect reveals how easily trauma can be mistaken for guilt. But if a child's behavior under impossible circumstances seems suspicious to investigators, what about his parents? John and Patsy Ramsey faced the ultimate test of human behavior under extreme stress. They had lost their daughter, they were under police scrutiny, they were facing media attention unlike anything Boulder had ever seen. How they responded to this crisis would determine not just public opinion about their guilt or innocence, but the entire direction of the investigation. Within 48 hours of finding their daughter's body, John and Patsy Ramsey made a decision that would haunt them for decades. They hired criminal defense attorneys, not victim advocates, not grief counselors, not public relations experts to manage the media circus. They hired lawyers who specialized in defending people accused of murder. To investigators, this looked like consciousness of guilt. To the public, it looked like parents who knew they needed legal protection because they had something to hide. But to the Ramseys, it may have been the only rational response to a situation that was spiraling completely out of their control. This decision to lawyer up immediately, to limit their cooperation with police, to treat the investigation as adversarial rather than collaborative, would define how the world saw them for the next 3 decades. It would turn grieving parents into public suspects and transform a murder investigation into a battle between family and law enforcement. The question that would follow John and Patsy Ramsey for the rest of their lives: were they protecting themselves because they were guilty? Or were they protecting themselves because they were innocent people who understood they were being treated as suspects? December 27th, 1996. 24 hours after finding their daughter's body in the basement, John and Patsy Ramsey made a phone call that would define the rest of their lives. They didn't call grief counselors. They didn't call victim advocates. They didn't call family support services. They called Haddon, Morgan, and Foreman, one of Denver's most prestigious criminal defense law firms. By December 28th, barely 48 hours after JonBenét's body was discovered, the Ramseys had retained Patrick Burke and Brian Morgan, attorneys who specialized in defending people accused of murder. Within a week, they had hired additional legal representation, including communications experts and private investigators. While police were still processing evidence from the crime scene, the Ramsey family was building a legal defense team that would cost millions of dollars and last for decades. To Detective Steve Thomas and the Boulder Police Department, this decision looked like consciousness of guilt. In their experience, innocent parents cooperated fully with investigators. They answered every question. They submitted to polygraphs. They opened their lives completely to law enforcement because they wanted their child's killer found. The Ramseys' immediate turn to high-powered criminal defense suggested they knew they needed protection from criminal charges. But the Ramseys' legal team saw the situation very differently. From their perspective, John and Patsy were grieving parents who had walked into a police investigation where they were already being treated as suspects rather than victims. The crime scene had been compromised, evidence had been contaminated, media leaks were painting the family as guilty before any evidence had been analyzed. Under those circumstances, hiring legal representation wasn't consciousness of guilt. It was basic self-preservation. The legal strategy that emerged from this decision would shape every aspect of the Ramsey case for the next 3 decades. It would determine what information police could access, which questions the family would answer, and how the public perceived their cooperation with the investigation. Most importantly, it would transform what should have been a collaborative effort between family and law enforcement into an adversarial battle that continues to this day. The immediate impact of the legal representation was a dramatic change in the family's accessibility to investigators. In the first hours after JonBenét's body was found, John and Patsy had spoken openly with Detective Linda Arndt and other officers at the scene. They had answered questions about their timeline, their activities the previous evening, their discovery of the ransom note. They had seemed, by most accounts, cooperative and forthcoming. But once the attorneys arrived, everything changed. Formal police interviews that had been scheduled were postponed. Requests for polygraph examinations were declined. Access to the family for follow-up questions was restricted. The Boulder Police Department found themselves dealing not with grieving parents, but with a legal team that treated every interaction as a potential threat to their clients. The attorney's first priority was controlling information flow. They immediately implemented what criminal defense lawyers call damage control, limiting their clients' exposure to potential incriminating statements while gathering intelligence about the police investigation. This meant extensive preparation before any police interaction, careful scripting of responses to likely questions, and strategic decisions about which requests to honor and which to decline. From a legal perspective, this approach was textbook criminal defense work. Defense attorneys are trained to assume that police investigations can go wrong, that innocent people can be wrongly accused, and that any statement made to law enforcement can potentially be used against their client in court. The Ramseys' attorneys were doing exactly what they were trained to do: protect their clients from potential prosecution. But from an investigative perspective, the legal strategy looked like obstruction. Detective Thomas and his colleagues needed to conduct timely interviews while memories were fresh. They needed to ask follow-up questions as new evidence emerged. They needed access to the family's computers, records, and personal communications to rule them out as suspects or build a case against them. The legal team's protective approach meant critical investigative work was delayed or prevented entirely. The tension came to a head in April 1997, 4 months after JonBenét's death, when the Ramseys finally agreed to formal police interviews. But even these interviews came with conditions that frustrated investigators. John and Patsy would be interviewed separately, with their attorneys present, with limitations on topics that could be discussed, and with the right to end the interviews at any time if their lawyers felt the questioning was inappropriate. The interviews themselves revealed the impact of the legal strategy. John and Patsy's answers were careful, measured, and often prefaced with phrases like, "to the best of my recollection," or "I believe," language that attorneys use to protect clients from perjury charges if their memories prove inaccurate. When pressed on details that seemed inconsistent with physical evidence, they frequently deferred to their attorneys or claimed they couldn't remember specific details. To investigators, these careful responses felt evasive. If the Ramseys were truly innocent, why couldn't they answer direct questions directly? Why did they need legal consultation before responding to queries about their own actions? Why were they so concerned about potential inconsistencies if they had nothing to hide? But to the defense team, their clients' careful responses were evidence of good legal advice being followed. John and Patsy had been through enormous trauma. They were sleep-deprived, emotionally devastated, and facing the most intense media scrutiny imaginable. Under those circumstances, memory errors were inevitable, and any error could be seized upon by investigators as evidence of deception. The careful language wasn't evasion, it was accuracy. The legal strategy extended beyond just police interactions. the Ramseys' attorneys also launched their own investigation, hiring private investigators, forensic experts, and public relations professionals. This parallel investigation served multiple purposes. It could identify evidence that might exonerate the family, it could prepare responses to police findings, and it could shape public opinion about their client's innocence. The private investigation strategy was controversial but effective. The Ramseys experts challenged police findings about handwriting analysis, questioned the reliability of interrogation techniques used with Burke, and identified potential suspects that police had allegedly overlooked. They provided alternative explanations for evidence that police viewed as incriminating, and they highlighted investigative failures that could undermine the prosecution's case. Most significantly, the legal team controlled their clients' media appearances with the same strategic precision they applied to police interactions. John and Patsy appeared on CNN in January 1997, just weeks after JonBenét's death, in a carefully orchestrated interview designed to humanize them and present their version of events to the public. The appearance was controversial. Some viewers saw grieving parents pleading for help finding their daughter's killer. Others saw calculated performance designed to manipulate public opinion. The media strategy revealed the sophisticated nature of the Ramseys' legal approach. This wasn't just about avoiding criminal charges. It was about winning the court of public opinion. The attorneys understood that in a case generating this level of media attention, public perception could be as important as legal evidence. If they could convince the public of their client's innocence, it would be much harder for prosecutors to obtain convictions even if charges were eventually filed. The long-term consequences of the legal strategy were profound. The immediate hiring of criminal defense attorneys established a narrative of family guilt that would persist for decades. Every subsequent action by the Ramseys, every declined interview, every qualified statement, every legal maneuver was viewed through the lens of that initial decision to lawyer up. What the family saw as protecting their rights, the public saw as hiding guilt. The legal approach also fundamentally changed the nature of the police investigation. Instead of investigating a murder with cooperative victims' families, Boulder police found themselves in an adversarial relationship with potential suspects who had significant legal resources. This dynamic made standard investigative techniques more difficult and created a relationship between law enforcement and the family that was hostile rather than collaborative. Perhaps most importantly, the legal strategy may have prevented the case from ever being resolved. By limiting police access to the family, the attorneys may have prevented investigators from gathering evidence that could have definitively proved innocence or guilt. The protective approach that was designed to prevent wrongful prosecution may have also prevented rightful prosecution if the family was involved, or it may have prevented the clearing of innocent people if they weren't involved. The polygraph issue illustrates this dynamic perfectly. Boulder police requested multiple times that John, Patsy, and Burke submit to polygraph examinations. The family's attorneys consistently declined, arguing that polygraph results aren't admissible in court and that the tests are unreliable. From a legal perspective, this was sound advice. There was no upside for the clients and significant potential downside if the results were interpreted as deceptive. But the refusal to take polygraphs became, in public perception, evidence of guilt. Innocent people, the logic went, would want to take any test that might help clear them. The fact that John and Patsy eventually did submit to private polygraph examinations arranged by their own attorneys and reportedly passed them didn't change public perception about their earlier refusals. The Ramseys' legal team also controlled their clients' relationship with other investigative agencies. When the FBI offered to assist with the case, the family's attorneys negotiated the terms of that cooperation. When a grand jury was impaneled to hear evidence, the legal team prepared their clients extensively for potential testimony. When media reports cited law enforcement sources making accusations against the family, the attorneys responded with public statements defending their clients. This level of legal sophistication was unusual in Boulder, Colorado. The small police department wasn't accustomed to dealing with suspects who had access to elite legal representation. The attorneys' tactics, perfectly standard in high-profile criminal cases, seemed excessive for what should have been a straightforward murder investigation. The legal maneuvering itself became evidence, in some people's minds, that the family had something to hide. But the Ramsey supporters argued that the legal strategy was vindicated by subsequent events. When DNA evidence emerged that pointed away from the family, when the grand jury's true bill was revealed to the public, when independent experts challenged the police investigation's findings, the defensive legal approach looked prescient rather than obstructive. The attorneys had protected their clients from wrongful prosecution in a case where the police had focused on the wrong suspects. The legal strategy also highlighted broader questions about the American criminal justice system. Should innocent people need expensive legal representation to avoid wrongful prosecution? Should grieving parents have to choose between cooperating with police and protecting their legal rights? Should the ability to hire elite attorneys determine whether someone can successfully defend themselves against suspicion? The Ramseys had resources that most families facing similar situations don't have. They could afford attorneys who specialized in high-profile criminal cases. They could hire private investigators and forensic experts. They could control their media appearances and public messaging. Most importantly, they could maintain their legal defense for decades, outlasting changes in law enforcement personnel and prosecutors. But those same resources that protected them also made them appear guilty to much of the public. The extensive legal maneuvering, the careful statements, the parallel investigations, all of it looked like the behavior of people who knew they were guilty and were using their wealth and connections to avoid consequences. The tragedy of the Ramseys' legal strategy is that it may have been both necessary and self-defeating. Necessary because they were being treated as suspects in their daughter's murder despite limited evidence of their involvement. Self-defeating because their defensive legal posture reinforced suspicions about their guilt and may have prevented the kind of cooperation that could have definitively resolved the case. John Ramsey, now in his 80s, has said in recent interviews that he has no regrets about hiring attorneys immediately after JonBenét's death. He maintains that the Boulder Police Department had already decided the family was guilty and that legal representation was essential to prevent wrongful prosecution. He points to the DNA evidence that eventually emerged, the grand jury indictment that was never signed, and the official exoneration issued in 2008 as vindication of their legal strategy. But critics argue that the legal approach prevented investigators from gathering evidence that might have solved the case definitively in either direction. By limiting access to the family, the attorneys may have protected their clients from false accusations, but they may also have prevented the kind of thorough investigation that could have identified the real killer if it wasn't a family member. The lawyer decision made within 24 hours of finding JonBenét's body would define the Ramsey family's relationship with law enforcement, media, and public opinion for the next 3 decades. Whether it was the rational response of innocent people protecting themselves from wrongful prosecution, or the calculated strategy of guilty people using legal resources to avoid consequences, remains a matter of debate. What's undeniable is that the decision changed everything. It turned cooperative potential witnesses into defensive potential suspects. It transformed a murder investigation into a legal battle. And it created a dynamic that may have prevented the case from ever being truly resolved. The legal strategy that began within 24 hours of JonBenét's death would protect the Ramsey family from potential prosecution, but it couldn't protect them from the contradictions in their own statements. Because while their attorneys could control what questions they answered and how they answered them, they couldn't change what the family had already said in those first chaotic hours when their lawyers weren't yet present. In the immediate aftermath of finding their daughter's body, John, Patsy, and Burke had spoken to police officers, family, friends, and each other about what had happened that night and the next morning. These early statements, made before legal counsel arrived, would become some of the most important evidence in the case. Not because of what they revealed, but because of how they contradicted each other and contradicted the physical evidence that investigators were uncovering. The pineapple found in JonBenét's stomach, the footprint in the basement that didn't match anyone in the family, the timeline of who woke up, when, and in what order. The question of whether Burke was asleep or awake during the 911 call. These weren't complex forensic mysteries that required expert analysis. These were basic facts about what happened in the Ramsey house on December 25th and 26th, 1,996. But 28 years later, those basic facts remain unclear because the people who lived through them couldn't agree on what had actually occurred. Every time investigators thought they had established a clear timeline, new statements or evidence would emerge that complicated or contradicted what they thought they knew. These weren't just memory lapses or trauma-induced confusion. These were fundamental inconsistencies about central events, and they would fuel suspicion about the family for decades. Because if the Ramseys couldn't tell a consistent story about their own actions, how could investigators determine what really happened that night? The Ramsey family's account of December 25th and 26th, 1996, seemed straightforward in those first chaotic hours after JonBenét's body was discovered. They had attended a Christmas party. The children fell asleep in the car on the way home. Everyone went to bed around 10 p.m. Patsy woke up early to prepare for their trip to Michigan. She found the ransom note on the stairs. She discovered JonBenét was missing. She called 911. But as investigators began examining physical evidence and conducting follow-up interviews, that simple timeline began to unravel. Not in dramatic ways, not in obvious lies, but in small contradictions and inconsistencies that accumulated over time. Each discrepancy seemed minor by itself, but together they created a picture of a family whose story about the most important night of their lives kept changing. The most significant contradiction centered on a bowl of pineapple found on the Ramsey kitchen table. Fresh pineapple, cut into chunks, with a large serving spoon. Burke's fingerprints were on the bowl. Patsy's fingerprints were on the spoon. But according to the autopsy, JonBenét had eaten pineapple approximately 1 to 2 hours before her death. When investigators asked John and Patsy about the pineapple, both parents insisted they had not given JonBenét any pineapple that night. They maintained that she had fallen asleep in the car during the drive home from the Christmas party and that John had carried her directly to her bedroom. She had not awakened, they said. She had not come downstairs. She had not eaten anything after they returned home. But the physical evidence contradicted this account completely. If JonBenét ate pineapple 1 to 2 hours before her death, and if she died sometime between midnight and 2 a.m., as the medical evidence suggested, then she had eaten that pineapple sometime between 10 p.m. and midnight. This meant she was awake and downstairs during the exact time period when her parents claimed she was asleep in her bedroom. When confronted with this contradiction, the family's explanations varied over time. Sometimes they suggested JonBenét might have eaten the pineapple earlier in the day, though the autopsy indicated it was consumed much closer to the time of death. Sometimes they suggested she might have awakened on her own and come downstairs for a snack, though they maintained they never saw her do this. Sometimes they simply said they couldn't explain the discrepancy. The pineapple contradiction was particularly troubling because it involved such a basic fact. Either JonBenét ate pineapple that night, or she didn't. Either she was downstairs after they returned home, or she wasn't. Either the parents gave her the pineapple, or someone else did. These weren't complex questions requiring expert analysis. They were simple matters of fact that the people who lived in the house should have been able to answer definitively. But the timeline contradictions went far beyond the pineapple. Burke's status during the early morning hours of December 26th remained unclear throughout the investigation. The family consistently maintained that Burke was asleep in his bedroom when Patsy found the ransom note and called 911. They said he didn't wake up until later that morning when police arrived. However, the enhanced audio from the 911 call suggested Burke might have been present and awake during the call. When investigators asked family members about this directly, their responses were inconsistent. Sometimes they acknowledged Burke might have awakened briefly and come downstairs. Sometimes they maintained he had slept through the entire initial crisis. Sometimes they said they couldn't remember clearly due to the traumatic nature of the situation. Burke's own statements about his activities that night and the next morning also changed over time. In his initial police interview just days after JonBenét's death, Burke said he had gone to sleep around 10 p.m. and hadn't awakened until police arrived. In later interviews, he sometimes acknowledged he might have gotten up during the night, though he claimed not to remember specific details. When asked about the pineapple bowl with his fingerprints on it, Burke's responses were particularly inconsistent. Sometimes he remembered eating pineapple that night. Sometimes he didn't. Sometimes he remembered JonBenét being in the kitchen with him. Sometimes he said he was alone. These weren't minor details. They were central facts about the last time anyone remembered seeing JonBenét alive. John Ramsey's timeline also contained contradictions that investigators found troubling. In his initial statements, John said he had gone to bed around 10 p.m. on Christmas night and hadn't awakened until Patsy's scream alerted him to the ransom note. But in later interviews, John sometimes mentioned checking on the children before going to sleep, sometimes acknowledged he might have gotten up during the night for other reasons. The most significant discrepancy in John's timeline involved his activities in the basement. When he and Fleet White searched the house that afternoon and John discovered JonBenét's body, he claimed it was the first time he had been in the basement that day. But some investigators believe John had been in the basement earlier that morning, possibly around the time the initial police search was conducted. The question of when John first went to the basement, and whether he had any reason to believe JonBenét might be there, became a major point of contention. Patsy's timeline contained its own set of contradictions, particularly regarding her activities the evening before and her morning routine on December 26th. Her account of putting JonBenét to bed, whether she changed her clothes, whether she checked on her later in the evening, what time she herself went to sleep, varied in different interviews. Her description of her morning routine also changed, particularly regarding what time she woke up, how long she spent getting ready, and exactly when she discovered the ransom note. The clothing evidence added another layer of timeline confusion. JonBenét was found wearing a white Gap shirt and white long underwear. But John and Patsy had said she was put to bed wearing the clothes from the Christmas party, a red turtleneck and black pants. When had she changed clothes? Who changed her? The family couldn't provide consistent answers to these questions. Some investigators believe the clothing change indicated JonBenét had awakened and changed into pajamas at some point during the night. Others suggested someone else had changed her clothes after the attack. The family's inability to explain this discrepancy definitively added to suspicions about their knowledge of what had actually occurred. The timeline contradictions weren't limited to the immediate family. Friends and family members who spoke with the Ramseys in the hours and days after JonBenét's death sometimes reported different versions of events than what John, Patsy, and Burke told investigators. These third-party accounts created additional inconsistencies that investigators struggled to reconcile. Fleet White, the family friend who was present when JonBenét's body was discovered, gave investigators his own timeline of events that didn't always align with the family's account. His description of John's behavior when they found the body, his recollection of conversations with family members that morning, and his observations about the family's demeanor all contained details that seemed inconsistent with statements the Ramseys had made to police. The timeline contradictions became more problematic as the investigation progressed because they seemed to multiply rather than resolve. Instead of memory improving with time or investigators clarifying details through additional questioning, new interviews often produced new inconsistencies. Facts that seemed established in early interviews were contradicted by statements made months or years later. Part of the problem was that the family was being questioned repeatedly by different investigators over a period of years. Each interview was conducted under different circumstances, with different objectives, and with different levels of legal preparation. The cumulative effect was a collection of statements that contained numerous small contradictions about basic facts. Defense attorneys and family supporters argued that these contradictions were exactly what you would expect from people who had experienced severe trauma. Memory under extreme stress is notoriously unreliable. The family had been through the worst possible experience, losing a child, and then been subjected to intensive questioning while they were grieving and in shock. Minor inconsistencies in the recollections were normal, not evidence of deception. But investigators saw a different pattern. The contradictions weren't just about peripheral details that might be affected by stress and trauma. They were about central facts that the family should have remembered clearly regardless of their emotional state. Whether JonBenét ate pineapple that night, whether Burke was awake during the 911 call when John first went to the basement, these were significant events that shouldn't have been subject to memory lapses. More troubling to investigators was that some of the contradictions seemed strategic rather than random. When physical evidence contradicted the family's initial account, like the pineapple evidence, their explanations changed to accommodate the new information. When audio analysis suggested Burke might have been present during the 911 call, the family's statements about his whereabouts became less definitive. The pattern suggested to some investigators that the family was not simply misremembering details due to trauma, but actively adjusting their story as they learned what evidence investigators had found. If the family was innocent, their account should have remained consistent regardless of what evidence emerged. The fact that their story seemed to evolve based on investigative findings looked like consciousness of guilt. The timeline contradictions also created problems for the family's legal strategy. Defense attorneys prefer clients whose stories are consistent, clear, and supported by evidence. The Ramseys' attorneys found themselves in the difficult position of defending clients whose own statements contained significant inconsistencies. They had to develop explanations for why their clients' memories of crucial events kept changing. The legal team's approach was to attribute all contradictions to the family's traumatic state and the intensive questioning they had endured. They argued that the inconsistencies actually supported their client's innocence, because guilty people would have prepared a coherent story before speaking to investigators. The contradictions showed that the Ramseys were telling the truth as they remembered it, not reciting a carefully rehearsed lie. But this explanation had limitations. While trauma could certainly affect memory of some details, it was difficult to explain why the family couldn't maintain consistent accounts of such fundamental facts. The pineapple evidence, Burke's whereabouts, the clothing change, these weren't minor details that might be forgotten under stress. They were central elements of the case that should have been clearly remembered by people who lived through them. The timeline contradictions also highlighted one of the fundamental challenges in the JonBenét Ramsey case. The same evidence could be interpreted as supporting innocence or guilt, depending on your perspective. Family supporters saw trauma-induced memory inconsistencies. Critics saw evolving lies designed to match emerging evidence. Perhaps most significantly, the timeline contradictions prevented investigators from establishing a clear picture of what actually happened in the Ramsey house during the crucial hours of December 25th and 26th. Without a consistent account from the people who were present, investigators couldn't determine basic facts about when events occurred, who was involved, or how the crime unfolded. This uncertainty about the timeline affected every aspect of the investigation. If investigators couldn't establish when JonBenét last ate pineapple, they couldn't determine who might have given it to her, or when she might have encountered her attacker. If they couldn't determine whether Burke was awake during the crucial hours, they couldn't assess his potential knowledge of events. If they couldn't establish a clear sequence of events on the morning of December 26th, they couldn't determine whether the family's behavior was consistent with discovering a kidnapping or staging a cover-up. The timeline contradictions that began with simple questions about who ate pineapple when ultimately became one of the most significant obstacles to solving the case. Not because they provided definitive evidence of the family's guilt or innocence, but because they prevented investigators from establishing the basic factual foundation necessary for any coherent theory of what happened. 28 years later, those timeline contradictions remain unresolved. The physical evidence, the pineapple in JonBenét's stomach, the fingerprints on the bowl, the audio enhancement of the 911 call, continues to contradict aspects of the family's account. The family maintains their innocence while acknowledging that trauma may have affected their memories of specific details. But the contradictions serve as a reminder of how quickly a criminal investigation can become complicated by inconsistent witness statements, even when those witnesses are the victim's own family members. They illustrate how memory under extreme stress can become unreliable, and how the same inconsistencies that might indicate deception could also indicate trauma. Most importantly, they demonstrate how unresolved contradictions in witness testimony can prevent a case from ever reaching a definitive conclusion, leaving questions that persist for decades about what really happened and who can be believed. The timeline contradictions that emerged in those first days and weeks after JonBenét's death would never be resolved. The pineapple evidence that didn't match the family's account. Burke's presence during the 911 call that they couldn't explain consistently. The basic facts about who was where and when, that kept changing with each interview. These contradictions might have remained minor footnotes in a criminal investigation that eventually identified the real killer and moved toward prosecution. Instead, they became the foundation for 3 decades of public suspicion that destroyed what remained of the Ramsey family after their daughter's murder. Because in a case where no arrest was ever made, where no trial ever provided definitive answers, where no conviction ever established guilt beyond reasonable doubt, public opinion filled the vacuum left by the justice system. And that public opinion was shaped not by evidence that proved guilt, but by behavior that looked like guilt to millions of people watching from the outside. The family that lost JonBenét Ramsey on Christmas night 1996 would spend the next 28 years losing everything else: their privacy, their reputations, their right to grieve privately, their ability to live normal lives. Not because they were ever convicted of a crime, but because they behaved in ways that made them look guilty of one. This is the story of how suspicious behavior, whether born of trauma or guilt, can destroy lives just as effectively as criminal conviction. It's the story of what happens when the court of public opinion renders its verdict long before the justice system has finished its work. And it's the story of how 3 people who should have been remembered as the family that lost JonBenét became forever known as the family that America believes killed her. Patsy Ramsey died on June 24th, 2006, at the age of 49. Ovarian cancer, a recurrence of the disease she had beaten years earlier. She died in her father's arms at their family home in Roswell, Georgia, 10 years after her daughter's murder, still under suspicion for that murder, never having seen her name cleared, never having learned who really killed JonBenét. 2 years later, in July 2008, the Boulder County District Attorney would issue a letter officially exonerating the Ramsey family based on DNA evidence. Patsy never lived to see it. She died while much of the world still believed she had killed her own daughter. The tragedy of Patsy Ramsey's death wasn't just that she lost her battle with cancer. It was that she lost it while carrying the weight of accusations that had followed her for a decade. She died knowing that millions of people thought she was a murderer. She died knowing that her daughter's case remained unsolved. She died knowing that justice had failed both her murdered child and her surviving family. John Ramsey, who had lost his oldest daughter, Elizabeth, in a car accident in 1992, and his youngest daughter, JonBenét, to murder in 1996, now faced the loss of his wife to a disease that many who knew them believed was worsened by the stress of living under constant suspicion. In 10 years, he had lost 3 of the most important people in his life. 1 to accident, 1 to murder, 1 to illness accelerated by public hatred. At Patsy's funeral, John stood beside his wife's casket, knowing that some of the people attending believed she was a killer. He delivered a eulogy for a woman who had been portrayed in tabloids as a monster, who had been accused on television of strangling her own daughter, who had spent the last decade of her life defending herself against charges that were never filed because there wasn't enough evidence to support them. The destruction of the Ramsey family hadn't happened overnight. It had been a slow erosion over 10 years, a gradual loss of everything that had made their lives worth living: their reputation, their privacy, their sense of safety, their ability to trust others, their faith in the justice system, their hope that truth would eventually emerge. Burke Ramsey, who had been 9 years old when his sister was murdered, was 17 when his mother died. He had spent nearly half his life watching his family destroyed by suspicion. He had seen his parents accused of murder. He had watched his mother waste away from cancer while defending herself against claims she had killed his sister. He had grown up in a household where normal teenage activities were impossible because any public appearance would generate media attention and renewed speculation about the family's guilt. Burke's adolescence was shaped by the need for invisibility. He couldn't attend public school because other students, parents, and teachers would recognize his name. He couldn't participate in sports or activities because media attention would follow. He couldn't date normally because any girlfriend would eventually learn about his family's connection to one of America's most famous murder cases. He couldn't even plan for college without considering how his name recognition might affect his academic and social experience. The psychological impact on Burke was impossible to measure, but easy to observe. The confident, if unusual, 9-year-old who had spoken to investigators about his sister's death became a withdrawn teenager who avoided all public contact. The boy who had been described by teachers as social and engaged became a young man who seemed to trust no one outside his immediate family. John Ramsey faced his own form of destruction. The successful businessman who had built Axis Graphics into a billion-dollar company found his professional reputation in ruins. Business associates distanced themselves from him. Professional relationships became complicated by questions about his daughter's murder. The man who had been respected in Boulder's business community became the subject of whispered conversations and avoided social encounters. John's second marriage to fashion designer Jan Rousseau in 2011 represented an attempt to rebuild a normal life. But even that private ceremony was covered by media outlets interested in whether the woman who married John Ramsey believed he was innocent of his daughter's murder. There was no escape from the case, no private moment that couldn't become public scrutiny. The media's role in the family's destruction cannot be overstated. From the moment JonBenét's body was discovered, the case became entertainment rather than tragedy. Tabloids offered money for inside information about the family. Television programs featured segments analyzing the family's behavior frame by frame. Books were written proposing various theories about family guilt or innocence, with authors who had never met the Ramseys claiming to understand their psychology and motivations. The media coverage created a feedback loop that made resolution of the case nearly impossible. Every development in the investigation was leaked immediately, making it impossible for law enforcement to control information flow or conduct interviews without the subjects knowing what investigators had found. Every statement by family members was analyzed for signs of deception, making it impossible for them to speak publicly without their words being twisted to support various theories. Most damaging was the media's treatment of the family as entertainment rather than as real people experiencing the worst possible tragedy. JonBenét's death became a puzzle for amateur detectives to solve, a mystery for television producers to exploit, a story for authors to monetize. The real people at the center of the case, a murdered child and her surviving family members, became characters in other people's narratives. The long-term destruction was also financial. The Ramsey family spent millions of dollars on legal fees, private investigators, public relations experts, and security measures. John was forced to sell the Boulder house where JonBenet had lived and died because it had become a macabre tourist attraction. The family moved multiple times trying to escape media attention, each move requiring new security measures and careful planning to avoid photographers. The psychological toll on all three surviving family members was severe and lasting. John developed what he described as hypervigilance, an inability to feel safe in public spaces because he never knew when someone might confront him about the case. Patsy suffered from anxiety and depression that worsened her cancer symptoms and complicated her treatment. Burke developed social anxiety that made normal interactions with peers nearly impossible. The family's relationship with law enforcement remained adversarial for decades. Even as DNA evidence emerged that pointed away from the family, even as investigative failures became apparent, the Boulder Police Department never formally apologized for their handling of the case or acknowledged that their initial focus on the family had been misguided. The family felt abandoned by the very system that should have been working to find their daughter's killer. Perhaps most tragically, the focus on the family as suspects may have prevented the real killer from ever being identified. While investigators spent years trying to build a case against John, Patsy, and Burke, the actual perpetrator had time to destroy evidence, leave the area, or commit additional crimes. The tunnel vision that developed around family guilt meant that other leads were not pursued as aggressively as they might have been if the family had been definitively ruled out early in the investigation. The 2008 exoneration, which should have been the moment when the family's long nightmare ended, came too late for Patsy and too late to repair the damage that had been done to John and Burke. By the time the district attorney officially cleared the family, Public opinion was so entrenched that many people dismissed the exoneration as politically motivated or legally meaningless. The DNA evidence that led to the exoneration was the same evidence that had been available in some form since 1997. The technology that allowed for more sophisticated analysis in 2008 could have been applied years earlier if investigators had prioritized finding an unknown perpetrator over building a case against the family. The decade between the first DNA results and the official exoneration represented 10 years of destroyed lives that could have been prevented. Burke's decision to file a lawsuit against CBS in 2016 after the network aired a documentary accusing him of murder represented the first time any member of the family had fought back legally against media accusations. The $750 million lawsuit was settled in 2019 for an undisclosed amount, but the settlement couldn't undo 20 years of public accusations or restore the normal life Burke had never been allowed to have. John Ramsey, now 81 years old, continues to advocate for advanced DNA testing and genetic genealogy techniques that might finally identify his daughter's killer. He has given interviews, appeared on documentaries, and written books in an effort to keep the case active and push for resolution. But he does so as a man who has lost most of his family and spent 3 decades of his life defending against accusations that he participated in his daughter's murder. The destruction of the Ramsey family serves as a cautionary tale about the power of suspicion in the absence of proof. In a case where no arrests were made, no charges were filed, no trial was held, and no conviction was obtained, public opinion filled the vacuum left by the justice system. That opinion was shaped not by evidence of guilt, but by behavior that looked like guilt to people who had never experienced comparable tragedy. The family that should be remembered as victims became suspects. The people who should have received support and compassion became targets of hatred and suspicion. The investigation that should have focused on finding a killer became focused on proving the victims' family members were killers. 28 years after JonBenét's murder, the case remains officially unsolved, but the destruction of her family is complete and irreversible. Patsy died under suspicion. Burke spent his entire adult life defending against accusations made when he was 9 years old. John lost not just his daughter, but his wife, his reputation, his privacy, and his faith in justice. The real tragedy of the JonBenét Ramsey case isn't just that a 6-year-old girl was murdered and her killer never identified. It's that her family was destroyed by suspicion, by media exploitation, by investigative failures, and by a public that was willing to believe the worst about people who had already suffered the worst possible loss. This destruction was preventable. With better police work, more responsible media coverage, and a public more willing to distinguish between suspicion and proof, the Ramsey family could have been allowed to grieve privately while investigators worked to find the real killer. Instead, they became casualties of their daughter's murder, destroyed not by the person who killed JonBenét, but by the system that was supposed to find justice for her.